For 30 years, the people of Wren, South Carolina, watched an old woman push a rusted grocery cart a full mile out of town every single Tuesday. Leave 4 bags of food on the porch of a house nobody had lived in for decades, talk to the empty doorway like someone was standing in it, and then walk all the way home alone. They had decided, as small towns decide things, that Ottilie Hartwell had lost her mind. They were wrong. And the man who would prove them wrong had not eaten a real meal in 2 days the morning he stepped off the curb and said the 6 words that changed everything. "Let me assist with that, ma'am." Nobody else stopped. That was the part Asa Renfro never could explain to himself afterward. There were a dozen people on Mill Street that morning, and the cart's front wheel had just sheared clean off its bolt and pitched sideways into the gutter, and the old woman had grabbed the handle so hard to keep from going down with it that her knuckles had gone white as chalk. People slowed. People looked. And then people kept walking, because in a town that had been dying since the cotton mill closed, a frail woman fighting a broken cart was just one more sad thing you train yourself not to see. Asa was the only one who crossed the road. Before the truth came out, that one sentence would get him banned from the only grocery store still letting him through the door. Asa could not know that yet. He only knew she was about to fall. Asa was 29 years old, and he looked older, like men do when life has been charging them interest. He slept in the cab of a dead pickup behind the chain-link fence of the abandoned Hartwell textile mill. He and his partner pulled copper wire and scrap brass out of the dead machines and sold it by the pound to a salvage yard 2 counties over. Lung-ruining work that paid just enough for canned beans and cheap gas. He had a cough he tried not to think about, and on cold mornings it doubled him over before he could get a fire going. His partner's name was Cobb Tillery, and Cobb was the closest thing to family Asa had left in this world. They were an odd pair. Asa was lean and watchful, a man who measured a room before he entered it. Cobb was 33, built like a refrigerator, slow to speak and slower to anger, handed from one foster home to the next until he aged out into nothing at 18. He never knew his mother. He never knew his father. He used to joke that he came from the lost and found. And Cobb had one habit that drove Asa half crazy on cold nights. When Cobb slept, he hummed. The same melody, low in his chest, a sweet, sad little tune with a rise, and a fall like a question that never got answered. Asa had asked him once where it came from. Cobb shrugged and said he'd just always known it, far back as he could remember, like it had been waiting in him before he had words. Asa thought nothing of it. Why would he? It was just Cobb's sleeping song. But that was later. On this Tuesday morning, Asa only knew that an old woman was about to hit the pavement, so he caught the cart by its frame before it could drag her down, lifted the broken corner, and held the whole thing steady while she found her feet. "I've got it, ma'am," he told her. "You're all right. I've got it." She looked up at him, and Asa was struck by how clear her eyes were. He had expected the cloudy, faraway look people in town talked about. Instead, her eyes were a sharp gray, and they moved across his face, reading him like you read a price tag, fast and total. Her hair was white and pinned up under a faded blue scarf. Her coat was good wool, expensive once, mended now at the cuffs. Her shoes were polished. Everything about her said a woman who had been somebody and still kept her standards even after the money quit. "The will has been threatening to do that for a month," she said. Her voice was dry and even, with the flat, patient accent of the Carolina Piedmont. "I suppose today it kept its promise." "I can carry it for you," Asa said, "wherever you're headed. It's no trouble." She studied him a moment longer, and something behind those gray eyes seemed to come to a decision he could not read. "That is a long way to carry a broken cart, young man," she said. "I am going out 10-Yard Road, past the last street light, and then some." "Then we'd best start walking before it gets hot," Asa said, and he tipped the cart up onto its 3 good wheels, balanced the broken corner against his hip, and waited for her to lead. So they walked. And here is the thing the whole town had been wondering about for 30 years, the thing Asa was about to learn firsthand. They did not walk toward any home. They walked out past the boarded storefronts, past the shuttered diner, past the last houses with people in them, out where 10-Yard Road turned to cracked asphalt and then to gravel, until they came to a small collapsing bungalow set back in a yard gone to weeds and saplings. The porch sagged. The windows were dark and most were broken. A dead oak leaned over the roof like it was trying to listen at the door. No one had lived there in a very long time. Anyone could see that. The old woman stopped at the foot of the porch steps and folded her hands. "This is the place," she said. "You can set the bags right there on the boards by the door. Mind the third step, it's rotten through." Asa carried the 4 paper bags up and set them down where she pointed. White bread, a tin of sliced peaches, a quart of milk, and a tin of butterscotch candy with a faded paper label. He set them in a neat row against the doorframe, out of the weather. His stomach cramped when he lifted the bread, because it was warm through the paper and the smell of it hit him in a place his body had stopped letting him ignore. He had not eaten anything hot since Sunday. He set the bread down with the rest of it and said nothing about the cramp. And then he watched the old woman climb the steps as far as she dared, lean toward that empty black doorway, and say in a gentle voice with nothing crazy in it at all, "I left your peaches, and there's fresh milk this week. Eat something before you go back out. You always did forget to eat." Then she hummed a few low notes to the dark, turned around, and came back down the steps like she had just kissed a child goodnight. Asa stood at the bottom of those steps with his hands hanging empty at his sides, and the whole long road behind him, and he understood that he had walked a mile to deliver groceries to nobody, and that the strangest part was how it did not feel like madness at all. It felt like grief wearing its Sunday clothes. Before we go any further, do me a small favor. If this story has already hooked something in you, drop a comment telling me where you are watching from tonight. And if you believe quiet kindness still changes lives, hit that subscribe button so the next story finds you too. Now let us get back to Asa. Asa had no idea what to say, so he said nothing. He walked the broken cart all the way back to town beside her, and at the corner of Mill Street she thanked him and told him her name was Ottilie Hartwell, and he told her his, and she said Renfro. "That's a good plain name. Will you be on this corner next Tuesday, Mr. Renfro?" And Asa, who had nowhere in this world he needed to be, said yes, ma'am. He supposed he would. He walked back to the mill alone and tried to leave the whole thing behind him. He had too many problems of his own for a stranger's grief. He told himself that twice before the question caught him again. Who was she talking to? Somebody who forgot to eat. Somebody who liked butterscotch. Somebody she had been waiting on long enough that the waiting had become the point. He didn't sleep well that night. By morning he had already decided he would be back. He came back the next Tuesday with a new wheel bolted on from a dead shopping buggy at the salvage yard. He told himself it was for the cart. That was only half of it, because the details came out one Tuesday at a time, like buried things work their way up through soil. He learned that she never opened the butterscotch candy, just left a fresh tin each week and brought the old one home unopened, because butterscotch had been somebody's favorite and you don't eat another man's favorite candy. You keep it stocked and waiting. He learned that she counted her change twice at Sykes' grocery, not because she was poor, but because she had grown up poor and never trusted money to stay. He learned that her own house, the big white house on the hill above town with the columns and the wraparound porch, was full of small carved wooden birds. Sparrows, mostly. Dozens of them, on every sill and shelf and mantel, all whittled by the same young hand a long time ago. She picked one up once while they rested on her steps and turned it over in her fingers and put it back without a word. And Asa learned not to ask about the things her hands lingered on. Then there was the Tuesday she set the tin of peaches down by the dark doorway and said, without looking back at him, "I brought butterscotch again. I know it was always too sweet for you, but I can't bring myself to stop." She came back down the steps and found Asa watching her, and whatever she saw in his face made her say, "I know, Mr. Renfro. I know he's not in there. I just can't always make myself act like I know it." She smoothed her coat and started back up the road, and Asa followed, and something in him that had been treating the Tuesday ritual as a sad curiosity went cold. This was a wound she had been tending for 30 years, because stopping would mean admitting it was never going to close. He stopped wondering about her that day. He started worrying instead. What Asa could not have known was that someone else had been counting the Tuesdays too, and that person was not counting out of love. And he learned the melody. One Tuesday she stood at that empty doorway and hummed the whole thing through, the sweet, sad little tune with the rise and the fall, the question that never got answered, and Asa felt the hair stand up on his arms because he knew that song. He had been falling asleep to that song behind the mill for 2 years. It was Cobb's sleeping song. Note for note, breath for breath, it was Cobb's song. He could not make sense of it. How could he? He filed it away as a coincidence, a tune two lonely people happened to share, and he kept on coming. But the town had begun to talk, and the town never filed things away gently. The first sign was a look. One Tuesday morning, Asa stepped into Sykes' grocery ahead of Ottilie to carry the basket, and Idella Sykes glanced up from behind her register and glanced away too fast, as a person does when they've been told to look out for something. She rang up Ottilie's order without her usual small talk. When Asa reached to hand her the money, she took it without letting her fingers touch his. He said nothing about it to Ottilie on the walk out Tanyard Road, but he turned it over in his mind the whole way, that careful nothing of Idella's look, and by the time they reached the bungalow he had worked out what it meant. Somebody had been in that store before him and said his name in a way that changed the temperature of the room. He didn't know who yet. He would. A man named Purnell Croft saw to that. Purnell was the great-nephew of Ottilie's late husband, a soft-handed man in his 50s who sold insurance 2 towns over and who had spent 20 years waiting to inherit the Hartwell house and the Hartwell mill, neither of which carried a drop of his blood. The moment a homeless scrap picker started walking his elderly relative out to an abandoned house every week, Purnell smelled exactly the kind of trouble that could cost him an inheritance, and he went to work. He never went to court. Purnell was cleverer than that, and meaner. He went to the people. He sat in the back booth of the gas station coffee shop and told anybody who'd listened that the Renfro drifter had wormed his way into a confused old widow's good graces, that he was after the estate. He reminded everyone how strange Ottilie had gotten, all those Tuesdays talking to a dead house. He wrapped his greed up in concerns so smooth that half the town thanked him for caring. And the rumor did what rumors do. It spread, it curdled, and it came looking for Asa. It found him on a Tuesday morning at Sykes' grocery. Idella Sykes had run that store for 30 years and had always given Asa a nod, and once or twice a day-old loaf she couldn't sell. But this morning a man Asa didn't know blocked the aisle, and behind him stood Purnell Croft with his arms crossed and a small ugly smile, and the man told Asa, loud enough for the whole store to hear, that they didn't serve his kind, that everybody knew what he was doing to that poor old lady, and that he could turn himself around and get out. The store went silent. A woman near the registers pulled her child against her hip and looked at the floor. Asa felt every eye settle on him at once, and the worst of it, the part that cut deepest, was that for one moment even he wondered if they could be right, because he had been hungry his whole life, and the world had taught him that men like him were always guilty of something. He set down the basket, so it would not look like he was stealing it. He did not argue. Arguing was for people the room was on the side of. He walked out into the morning light with the whole town watching, his back straight only because he forced it straight, looking like the exact thief they had been promised. Idella Sykes stood behind her register with her jaw tight and said nothing, because Purnell Croft held a note on her store and she could not afford to make an enemy of him. But she watched Asa go, and she believed not a word of it, and she would remember this morning when its time came. That same afternoon a woman Asa recognized from the laundromat crossed to the other side of the road when she saw him coming. She didn't hurry. She just drifted over, as if she'd remembered something on the far sidewalk. She hadn't. Asa kept walking. He kept his stride even, but his hands curled into fists at his sides, and he could not unclench them for 3 blocks. 2 days after that, Purnell Croft drove up to Ottilie's house on the hill. She answered the door herself, as she always did, and he stood on her porch with his soft insurance man voice and told her people in town were worried. He said the word facility like it was a kindness. Ottilie stood in her doorway with one hand on the frame and looked at him like she had looked at the wheel on her cart the morning it snapped, as though she had expected this and was only sorry it had taken this long. People always call it worry, she said, when they want to take something from an old woman. Purnell left without what he came for, but he had another way and she knew it. That was the same week Purnell made his real move. He called the county and reported, all sweetness and worry, that his elderly aunt was wandering out to an abandoned property alone, talking to no one, clearly a danger to herself. He suggested she ought to be somewhere she could be looked after, a facility, for her own good. A social worker was assigned. In 11 days, A woman Ottilie had never met would sit in her living room and decide whether she still had the right to live in her own house. And the clock under this whole story sped up because Ottilie was failing. On the next Tuesday, she walked slower. Her breath came shorter. Twice she stopped against the cart, one hand flat to her chest, and when Asa asked if she ought to see a doctor, she fixed him with those sharp gray eyes and said, "I am 81 years old, Mr. Renfro, and I have one thing left to finish before I go, and I will not be put in a home before I finish it." She would not say what the one thing was. It was Cobb's song that finally broke it open. Asa lay awake one cold night listening to his friend hum that tune in his sleep, the rise and the fall, and it landed on him all at once like a beam coming down. The carved sparrows, the butterscotch nobody opened, the food left for a person who never came, the lullaby. He sat up in the truck cab and looked at Cobb sleeping beside him and thought, what if it didn't come from nowhere? What if somebody sang it to him before he had words? What if that somebody learned it in a big white house full of carved birds? The social worker was coming the next morning. That changed what this Tuesday was. It was no longer just a walk. It was the last chance to find what Ottilie had been waiting for before a stranger with a clipboard decided it no longer mattered. Cobb didn't want to. Cobb didn't like new people, and he liked old people even less, on account of all the foster grandmothers who'd sent him back. But Asa told him he needed him there, and that was a thing Asa had never once said in 2 years, so Cobb came. Asa told Ottilie he'd brought his partner to help with the heavy bags, and that was all. He could not have explained the real reason without sounding as mad as the town said she was. They walked the mile out to Tanyard Road, the three of them in the cart, Cobb hanging back and uneasy among the weeds, and Ottilie climbed her usual 2 steps and leaned toward the doorway and began her usual gentle words. And then, as he always did when he stood still too long, Cobb started to hum. Low in his chest, without thinking, the rise and the fall, the question with no answer. Ottilie stopped speaking. She went still as the dead oak over the roof. Then she turned around. The color drained out of her face until it matched her white hair, and she stared at this enormous stranger humming on the porch steps of the house she had been feeding for 30 years. She said in a voice that had cracked right down the middle, "Where did you learn that song?" Cobb stopped humming. He shifted those big shoulders and looked at the ground like a boy caught at something, and he said he didn't know, ma'am. He'd just always known it, far back as anything. And Ottilie pressed her hand flat to her chest and reached for the rotten railing to hold herself up, and the words came out of her, shaking. "My son made up that song. He made it up when he was 9 years old, sitting on this very porch, whittling birds out of pine. I sang it to him in his cradle, and he made it his own. And there is not one other soul on this earth who knows it, because he never wrote it down, and he never sang it for anyone but me." Her eyes climbed Cobb's face feature by feature, the brow, the jaw, the deep-set eyes, and they filled and spilled over. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Who are you, son? Where did you come from?" It came out in pieces on that sagging porch over the next hour, as truth usually does, not all at once, but in the order a person can bear to say it. Her son's name was Roan. She said it and stopped, and for a breath she had the look of a woman who had just spent something she'd been saving for a very long time. Cobb didn't react to the name. Why would he? It meant nothing to him. But Asa watched Ottilie's face and kept still. Roan had hated the mill and everything the Hartwell money had built, she said. At 20 he walked away from all of it, swore he would not take a single Hartwell dollar, and went to live rough out on the edge of the county. She had let him go thinking he'd come back once the pride wore off. He didn't. When she finally drove out here to beg him, he stood on these very steps and told her no, and she left in tears, and the last thing she said was that if he ever came home hungry, food would be waiting. She had no notion it would be the last thing she ever said to him. 3 weeks later, a fever took him in this house, and he was buried before she could reach him. Cobb had gone very still on the porch steps, his eyes fixed on that dark doorway as if it had called his name. For 30 years she had kept the promise, Ottilie said. Kept it because breaking it felt like burying him twice. Nobody spoke for a moment. The dead oak over the roof made a sound in the wind. Somewhere down in the weeds a bird called once and went quiet. Then Asa asked the question that nobody in 30 years had thought to ask. Was there anyone with him? When he was out here, Was he alone? Ottilie looked at him. Her eyes went somewhere inward. I never looked, she said. I was so busy feeding the dead. I never thought to look for the living. That was when Asa told her about Cobb, plainly without decoration. A man raised in foster care knowing nothing about where he came from. Cobb had told him once. The file said no mother's name, no father's. 3 counties over. A song he'd always known and couldn't account for. And a small carved wooden bird he'd carried since before he had words. Ottilie's hand went to her mouth. Cobb had learned young not to ask where he came from. Every time he asked, someone handed him a file, a shrug, or a lie. He had stopped asking before he was 10. Cobb stood up off the step. No, he said, but the word came out thin. People like me don't turn out to belong to places like this. That's not how it works. He was shaking his head, but his hands were shaking too. And Asa could see that the big man was not rejecting the idea so much as bracing for it to be snatched back, because everything always got snatched back. What she had never known, what no one in Wren had known, was the rest of it. Roan had not lived in that bungalow alone. A poor woman named Delphia had loved him and stayed through his hard-chosen life, and she had borne Roan a son in this very house. The baby was barely 2 when the fever took Roan. Delphia, terrified of the grand cold family on the hill, ran rather than ask them for anything. Within a year she too was gone, and the child passed into the foster system 3 counties away under his mother's last name, a name the Hartwells had never known to look for. Tillery. Cobb Tillery, the baby born in that house on Tanyard Road. The grandson Ottilie never knew existed. The boy who carried his dead father's song in his blood and hummed it in his sleep for 30 years without ever knowing it was the sound of home. For 30 years, she thought she was feeding a ghost. She was not. She had been walking to the house where her grandson was born, leaving food on the porch where his father had carved him a bird, humming a lullaby through a doorway that led straight to the beginning of a life she never knew existed. The groceries had been reaching the right doorstep all along. Nobody reached for him. Nobody tried to prove it too fast. Because a man who has been unwanted his whole life does not survive by believing good news the first time it arrives. Cobb had one thing from his infancy, the only object that had followed him through every foster home, logged in his file with 3 cold words, found with child. He kept it on a leather cord around his neck. He pulled it out now with his big shaking hands. It was a small carved wooden sparrow, worn smooth by 30 years of being held by a boy who had nothing else. Ottilie took it. She turned it over. On the bottom, in the clumsy proud strokes of a child with a pocket knife, were 2 letters. RH. She made a sound that was not quite a word, a grief 30 years deep turning over in its grave and finding out it was not the end of the story after all. He carved this, she breathed. Roan carved this for you. Before he died, he sat in that house and made his boy a bird. She reached up and pulled that enormous lost man down onto the rotten step, and Cobb Tillery, who had spent 33 years without one person on this earth, who was his by blood, who had been sent back by every family that ever tried him, wept like the 2-year-old he had been the last time he sat on that porch. The old woman rocked him and hummed the song, and for the first time in his whole life Cobb was not humming it alone. Now, you might think this is where Purnell Croft loses everything in some grand dramatic scene. It was quieter than that and worse for him. The social worker came on the appointed day and found a sharp, clear-eyed woman who had been keeping a 30-year promise to a dead son and who had, that very week, found that son's living child. There was nothing to evaluate. There was only a family, and the town learned the whole story like small towns learn everything, all at once and from everyone. They learned the ritual had a reason that would break your heart. They learned that the drifter they'd run out of Sykes' grocery had been the only man kind enough to walk her out and hold the cart. And they learned exactly what Purnell Croft had tried to do and why. He did not lose a lawsuit. He lost the town. Within a month his soft-handed face was gone from Wren, and not one person went looking for him. And here is the part one most wanted to tell you. Asa Renfro had walked into this expecting nothing, and Cobb's good fortune could easily have left him alone in that yard while the rich found their blood and the drifter went back to the mill. That is not what happened. The first thing Cobb Tillery did was take Ottilie's hand and tell her plain that Asa was his brother, and that wherever Cobb landed, Asa landed too, or Cobb didn't land at all. And Ottilie, who had spent 30 years learning that family is not only the people who share your blood, but the people who show up and stay, opened her arms and her house and her name to him just the same. So Asa got three things, and not one of them was a check, because a check would have insulted everything he was. He got a home. Ottilie owned that dead mill where Asa had been killing his lungs for scrap, and on its grounds stood the old foreman's house with a workshop behind it, full of tools gone to rust. She pressed the key into his palm and told him what she had watched for weeks. Him bolting a salvaged will onto her cart, whittling shapes from scrap pine and tucking them in his pocket like they embarrassed him, mending the broken latch on her gate and saying nothing. He had maker's hands, she told him, same as Roan had. It was a sin to use them tearing dead machines apart for pennies. The house was his. The workshop was his. Stop scavenging and start building. He got a brother who was truly his, blessed and named and standing in the light at last. The only family either of them had ever had, now doubled and made real. They had walked into this story as a scavenger and a stray, and walked out of it as the grandson of the house, and the brother the grandson would not live without. And he got the thing that does not have a price. One morning, weeks later, Asa walked back into Sykes' grocery, the same store he'd been thrown out of, and the same town that had watched him go now watched him come back, and there was not a thief among them who could meet his eye. Idella Sykes rang up his groceries with tears standing in her own, and she didn't charge him for the bread, and when he tried to argue, she put her hand flat on the counter and said, "You let me do this one thing." Then her voice broke, because I should have done the right thing when it mattered. He let her. He carried his own groceries out into the South Carolina sun, a man whose name had been cleared not by a court and not by a fortune, but by the plain, stubborn truth of who he had always been, which the whole town could finally see. The world does not get better when the rich decide to be generous. It gets better when a starving man with nothing to gain crosses an empty road to steady a stranger's cart, because steadying it is the right thing to do, and there is nothing in it for him at all. The kind of goodness with no audience. The kind with no payday. That is the only kind that has ever changed anything. Ottilie Hartwell did not die that winter, as her doctors had warned. Stubborn people often don't, once they've found a reason to stay. She had her grandson now, and the long task of teaching him that he had always belonged somewhere, that the song had always been his, that the sparrows were his birthright. She lived to see the foreman's house lit up at night, the workshop tools scrubbed clean. Asa Renfro set up as the man who could build or fix anything, the trade the town had needed for years. And out on Tanyard Road, the bungalow does not sit dark anymore. Cobb cleared the saplings and shored up the porch and put glass back in the windows of the house where he was born. On still evenings, the three of them sit out there as the light goes blue, a grandmother and her grandson and the brother who brought them together, and they do not leave food on the porch anymore. The promise has been kept. The hungry one came home. There is only one thing left on that porch railing. Two small carved wooden sparrows, side by side. One is old, worn smooth by 30 years, with the initials RH cut in the bottom by a 9-year-old boy who made up a song and gave it to his unborn son. The other is brand new. The first bird Asa ever carved with his own hands, set down right beside the old one, the same and not the same, because that is what family is. The blood you're given and the blood you choose, sitting together in the evening light. If this story stayed with you, tell me which part broke you most, the song, the sparrow, or the moment the hungry one finally came home. Subscribe so the next story finds you. And remember what Asa knew before anyone thanked him for it. The kindness that changes the world is the kind you give before you know it will ever come back to you. I'll see you in the next one.